I'm going to read from the Sacramento Daily Union, Volume 12, number 4144. July 2nd, 1864. News of the morning. Daring stage robbery. During yesterday afternoon, the town was full of rumors and extravagant statements concerning the robbery of Wells Fargo and Company's Express, the other side of Placerville. The amount of coin and bullion reported to have been taken was variously stated at from $5,000 to $40,000, but little specific information was received at Wells Fargo and Company. The Pioneer Company's stage was stopped by 6 or 7 men armed with shotguns and pistols. Compelling a halt, robbers broke open the chest and took out the contents. 12 silver bricks and a small quantity of gold coin were taken. After the first stage had been started forward, one of the passengers, a Virginia City police officer, is reported to have fired 2 shots at one of the robbers. It is probable, however, that no injury was done as they stopped the second stage, which came along a few minutes afterwards. They took a quantity of gold coins from the stage, but did not disturb the bullion. Here, to set the record straight about the events of June 30th, 1864, is Stagecoach driver Charlie Watson.
Good afternoon, everybody. I drove for the Pioneer Stage Line. We had stages running between Sacramento and Virginia City day and night. Kept me busy, and the company was second only to the California Stage Line run by Wells Fargo, which had connecting hubs in Sacramento, Folsom, and Marysville. We get a lot of passengers coming west into California, seeking their golden opportunity. And traveling over the Sierra Mountains wasn't as perilous as it was in 1857. The road was much improved, and the toll keepers maintained the climb to be no greater than 7%. I often wondered about getting into that business one day. Delia, my wife, well, she didn't see so much of me, and we also had little George, who was just 3. I was thinking it was time for me to find a way to be home with my family. There's a station stop at the base of the climb going up to Slippery Ford called Strawberry. Now that's a real nice spot. I thought if I could purchase that place, I'd still be doing what I know and get my wife's good cooking too. Well, with the war going on and the Pioneer Stage Line coming right out of the Comstock, you could say we were running the payroll for the entire federal government. We carried bullion, coin, and the regular mail. Shoot, the mines alone in Virginia City made over $20 million the previous year. That's over 100 tons of bullion going into San Francisco. That's a heck of a lot of business. And the Pioneer Stage Line, I'm proud to say, was the biggest and about the only regular line you'd find coming and going over the mountains. Well, it was a night in June of '64. I was just coming up out of the American River Canyon, driving a 6-up team with a full load of passengers from Virginia City. It was late enough that I had the side lamps on. Can't see much with them, but others can see you coming. I knew that the stagecoach just a little ahead of mine was young Ned Blair's. His load was about the same as mine. Now, I didn't handle the mail, and I didn't touch the bullion. But when that strong box was loaded up, it was my job to get it to where it needed to go. I'm not a banker, but I know that strong box was rarely riding empty, heading west. The road gets pretty narrow, and you can't travel fast on it very safely, especially as you're coming up out of the canyon. There's a pretty tight curve there, and doggone it, if I don't see Ned's lamps just a little ahead of mine, and he stopped. I figured, something must have broke, or maybe one of his horses somehow got injured. Road wasn't very busy, as it was near 10 o'clock that night, but I had a schedule to keep, and I needed to get his coach moving or out of the way as quick as I could. So, I hauled back, set the brake, handed the reins over to the passenger who was riding up along with me to see what Ned needed. I stuffed about 4 or 5 rods behind Ned's coach. That's about 80 feet. But before I could get to my lead horses, out of the darkness, a big shotgun barrel meets me, and I'm made aware that this was a robbery. Well, I got back up on the box just as instructed and stayed put. Ned's coach was let go pretty quick, and then the rest of the gang of the robbers came up to mine. But before his lamps disappeared around the bend, one of his passengers shot back at us with a pistol. Well, that got my lead horses more than nervous, and here we were, less than a foot of running room on the downhill side of the stage, and a tall bank going up about 10 feet on the other side, and in front, a hard gang of robbers, all hopping mad. I had to talk calm for the sake of all of our souls. I told my passengers not to fire and reminded those robbers that we weren't the coach that fired on them. They calmed down, and their leader comes up to me and says, "Gentlemen, I will tell you who we are. We are not a gang of robbers, but a company of Confederate soldiers. We don't want anything of the passengers, so don't act foolish. All we want is Wells Fargo's treasure to assist us to recruit for the Confederate Army." Well, you gotta understand that the war affected us even out here in California. Both sides wanted to get their hands on the gold and were willing to rip our state in two in order to get it. These fellas were part of the Knights of the Golden Circle out of San Jose. Anyway, I threw down 2 sacks of bullion, and one of the robbers found another sack. They took the Genoa Express box and some freight they thought was worth it. My passengers kept pretty quiet, except for one of the ladies. She started talking to the robber that was covering us with a gun from the front wheel. Now, I suppose that made them Southern sympathizers feel a little more at ease, but it also gave them the impression to ask my passengers for a few dollars to contribute to their cause. Now, I don't think you're giving someone an option to not contribute whilst you're holding a gun on. Anyway, I figured they got about $20,000 in coin and dust, but it wasn't like we were counting things out between us. Then their leader hands me a blank receipt. I was to fill in the amount they had taken and hand it to the first authorities I came across. Anyway, the man holding on to my lead horses let go, and we were allowed to move on. We had about 1.5 miles to 13 Mile House. That's where Colonel F.A.B. and his brother had installed one of the telegraph stations. Now, as long as the Teamsters who hauled heavy freight didn't cut the wires to do their roadside repairs, that telegraph line maintained a good communication between Placerville and Carson City. We did get into Placerville, but the word got there well before us. I handed off the reins from there and joined up with Sheriff Rogers and his posse to go find the bandits that same night. We left Placerville around midnight. Now, I was probably a little excited and running on what you nowadays call adrenaline. Well, we galloped back up on the Placerville-Carson Valley Road and came across a couple of suspicious fellas. Well, I don't know, they just seemed suspicious, kind of hanging back, curious, but not showing their faces. Maybe one of them was one of the robbers that shoved a gun on me in the dark. Maybe I was just starting to see robbers everywhere. Well, the sheriff took him back to 13 Mile House and questioned him. Turned out they hadn't anything to do with it. Later that morning, that Constable Van Eaton showed up from tracking over the Diamond Pleasant Valley Road. He and Constable Ranny and Deputy Staples had found the tracks of the horsemen going into Somerset. and they split right there at Spencer's place, now a market holiday. Van Eaton said the posse had to get down there and help Randy and Staples, but by the time we got there, the two lawmen had gotten in a tangle with the robbers, and Staples was shot dead. Well, I did give testimony when they brought 3 of the robbers into court. Then I had to get back to my occupation. But you could imagine my nerves were on edge. In fact, it was the very next year I did buy that station stop called Strawberry. I was not going to be a target for any more road agents. Well, Delia and I had a little girl in 1866, and another little boy too. My family and I ran a real nice place there, and we called it the Strawberry House. But I had to rebuild it after a fire in 1868. We did good business until the railroad cut in on the freight that was going over by wagon and stage. Still, it's always been such a beautiful spot. We ran it each year until Snowshoe Thompson had to start carrying the mail by foot over the snow-covered pass. Then we'd come down to winter in Placerville. My daughter Olive and her husband ran it as a resort after I passed on. Well, the buildings may have changed, but the heart of the place is the site itself, with the granite mountain behind it and the tall green pines and the fresh crisp air. Boy, would I love to see all that again. But I hear the traffic using that road nowadays is more than was during my time. Anyway, I've lived a pretty good life, and it's been filled with lots of stories. But that night, the stages got robbed. That had to have been one of the most important nights of my life.
I'm going to read an excerpt from the Placerville Mountain Democrat from July 9th, 1864. The funeral of Joseph M. Staples. Joseph M. Staples, who was killed by the stage robbers at the Somerset House while attempting to arrest them on Friday of last week, was buried by Neptune Engine Company No. 2 of this city, of which he was a member, on Saturday afternoon. His body was brought to this city on Friday night and placed in the hall of the company's building, which had been shrouded in mourning. Reverend Mr. Pierce on Saturday afternoon preached a feeling and impressive funeral sermon, which was listened to by members of the fire department, the county officials, a large number of ladies, and other friends of the deceased. He also read a beautiful and affectionate letter, breathing the very essence of purity and piety from the aged mother of the deceased to her beloved son, which he had received but a day or two before his tragic death, and which was found on his body. His funeral was largely attended by the citizens of Placerville and Coloma, he having been an old and esteemed resident of the latter place. He was an estimable citizen, an excellent officer, and a warm friend, brave, true-hearted and generous, modest, courteous and educated, and his death is deeply deplored by those who knew him best. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Deputy Sheriff Joseph M. Staples.
Well, howdy. My name is Joseph Staples. I was born in Ireland, but had little chance of making a living and owning land with the famine and the fighting over religion. We heard about the gold being found out west, free for whoever had the grit to come and get it. And I always had plenty of that. Now, I never did make it rich, and I never married either, but I did have a family of sorts. There are some characters I worked with, and like me, they came and they ended up staying. Not because they had to, but more because they wanted to. They wanted a life, a town, and a good place to live. And if we were lucky, well, maybe we made a name for ourselves as well. I always liked being part of the goings-on, so I joined the Placerville Volunteer Firefighters in Neptune Company No. 2. My friend James Hume became Undersheriff of El Dorado County in 1864. I was his deputy. We hunted down thieves and outlaws, chased bandits through the brush, the blue haze of gunpowder and the manzanita. But if you're just a common nuisance, stumbling around drunk or causing women folk to complain, that'd be handled by my friend John Dick Van Eaton. He was constable then and gave us a hand on more than one occasion. Then there was George Raney. He was more of a family man and made his living working with the forests and the trees around here. And, well, They're all a bit more cautious than I was, and maybe if I'd listened a bit more, I'd have a little more time on this earth before settling into that plot. It was spring of 1864, or May 25th or thereabouts, when we faced off against the McClellan gang up near Fiddletown. We got pinned down a ravine, and Van Eaton took a bolt in the hip, and that hobbled him pretty good. Then they shot my horse in the leg and went tearing out from underneath me, and all I could do was hold on. We managed to make it back to Placerville, and, well, the story of what happened came back with us. I suppose it was just some feller's way of trying to needle me, but some barfly goes on about how I took damn good care to keep out of danger. Well, you put him on a horse and turn into a bucking bronco, and then start hurling lead at him, and we'll see how he handles himself. Now that made my blood boil. It was also mighty hurtful because they all started laughing, like they could see it being true. So I said right then and there, the next time I go, I'll be brought back dead, I'll bring back my man. Well, Van Eaton hadn't fully healed from his hip wound when Stagecoach was robbed off at a blind turn past 13 Mile House. Now that turn was so sharp, you had to come to a darn near dead halt in order to pass it. And that's where those bandits, a gang of Confederates, laid in wait. They call it the Bullion Bend because that's what they stole out of the Wells Fargo strongboxes that night. They pulled off their heist at about, 10 o'clock, and Sheriff Rogers gets a message from the 13 Mile House, rounds up his posse, and heads to the scene of the crime. I meet up with Randy and Van Eaton, and, well, we have a conversation among ourselves, and, well, we decide we're going to head up to Diamond Springs, up through Pleasant Valley, to see if we can get a trace of them that way. So we set off in the dark, and we're coming up near Spencer's, and, well, the dawn's coming up, and we get down, and we're looking for tracks. And sure enough, we find fresh sets of 6 or 7 horses heading south towards Fieldtown, Stockton. Well, Van Eaton's got a good fast horse, so he decides to head back to Placerville to get the sheriff and his posse. Randy and I continue on to the next crossroads, because I sure wasn't going to lay off these tracks and let another gang of thieves get away. So we're coming up near the Somerset house, and Randy gets off his horse and ties him up to the oak tree, and I'm looking around when something catches my eye. A lone shotgun leaning against the wall of the last door of the Somerset house facing the road. So I go walking up to the open door of the kitchen. I see Miss Davis in there cooking up a big breakfast. And I says to her, "Good morning. You see any horsemen pass by this night?" She says about 6 had just come in. So I go walking out that door, grab up that linen shotgun, and I'm walking back to Randy with my heart pounding. He passes me and walks right into the last door of the Somerset house, and as cheery as he can be, says to him, "Good morning. You fellas see any horsemen pass by this night?" Well, I know we got him. These are those fellas that hit the stages, and I am sure of it. So I'm walking back up, cocking back the ears of my shotgun when he stops me. He puts his hand on my shoulder and goes, "Slow and close. Hold on. Right on it." Hold on? Hold on for what? Now, Randy wasn't one for taking chances, but I was taking action. And when he still tried to stop me, I lowered my shoulder into him and flung open that door on that nest of vipers. And I said, "You're all my prisoners. Surrender now." All those few moments seemed like a lifetime in themselves. I leveled my shotgun with the first man I saw, but there was more in the room. There may have been a standout for his snipe. I saw another man go for his gun, but the first man moved. That's all I could do. I heard bullets ringing out, and they hit me in the side, and they spun me around. Now, I hadn't planned on getting killed that day, but there I was, bleeding out on the floor of the Somerset house, and I see George running up behind me. Those bandits chased him out into the road, and they shot him up pretty good, too. They were dragging him back to put a bullet in his head when Mariah Randall comes running up and gives them a tongue lashing. "Aren't you ashamed for shooting a dead man?" Well, if it wasn't for her, there would have been 2 of us coming back, boots first that day. I don't know what I would have done if I had survived, but my dying sure seemed to have significant impact on my friends' lives. James Hume, well, he was on his way back from Stockton when he got word about where Randy and I were heading. And he arrived in Placerville just in time to join Sheriff Rogers and Constable Van Eaton, all hurrying up to the Somerset house. But it was too late. George was alive and taken back to Placerville for care, and he brought my body back and had displayed it at the firehouse so my friends could come and pay their last respects. James had purchased this here plot just in case he came back sunny side up someday. Neither of us knowing he would eventually be giving it to me as my final resting place. James Hume tracked down my killers and brought Thomas Poole to justice. After Thomas recovered from the injuries sustained from my shotgun blast, he was tried, convicted, and finally hanged in Placerville the very next year. James Hume did such a good job investigating the crime that Wells Fargo made him head of the new detective bureau. Your dad's still working for Wells Fargo 40 years later in 1904. As for Van Eaton, well, him being from the Carolinas and the gang being a bunch of Confederates made things uncomfortable, to say the least. We'll use that southern drawl and smooth charm to win over the confidence of the prisoners and gain the information on the other's whereabouts. So he tracked down my killers and brought them all to justice. But he moved from Pottsville shortly thereafter. His grandson will later go on to say that Van Eaton was a staunch Democrat, but voted for Lincoln in 1864. Randy and Van Eaton quit the badge shortly after Bullion Bend, never fully quite getting over what happened that day. And George went back to being a carpenter and a millwright. And you know, I still often wonder what could have been had I not been so brash and instead listened to the advice of my friends.
We hope you have enjoyed that story today. Just once again, I want to thank Charlie Watson and Sheriff Joseph N. Staples for sharing their stories today. You enjoyed it.